My name is Peter Arnold. I'm a retired forester. Well, I was born in San Francisco, but lived in Marin County all my life, Kentfield, where my great-grandfather had moved in the 1870s. So we kids had 900 acres to play in what is now Kent Woodlands, and was then just undeveloped land. And I guess that started me in my enjoyment of outdoor life, you might say. We grew up pretty much unfettered. We go wherever we wanted. You know, it's interesting today where kids, you don't know where they're going to be. You want to know where they are all the time. Our family didn't care where we were. We were just everywhere. Well, my grandfather was born in Chicago and grew up there. My great-grandfather had been in the meatpacking industry during the Civil War. And then he moved west in the 1870s and settled in Marin County, but also had a ranch up in Nevada, up near Winnemucca. And my grandmother grew up in New Haven, Connecticut. Her father was a professor of Latin at Yale. And my grandfather, as he started in at Yale, was living with the Thatcher family. And that's how they met and subsequently married. He was an alderman in Chicago, got into politics there. But then when he got to California, that's when he ran for Congress. And he wrote the bill that turned out into the creation of the National Park Service in 1916. My grandfather, William Kent, was approached by some people because what was then just, I don't know what they called it, but they were going to log it anyway. And so these people came and asked my grandfather if he wouldn't buy it to hold on to. So he did. And then later on, the town of Mill Valley decided they wanted a water supply. So they're going to dam that. And that's when he, at that time, was in Congress, and he knew Teddy Roosevelt. And the Antiquities Act had just gone in. And so he offered the property to the country as an antiquity because these redwoods had been there long before anybody else. So that's how it wound up that way. I'd been in the University of California under a Navy program for eventual midshipman school to become an officer, but I flunked out there because I knew the war couldn't be won without me. So off I went to boot camp. And so then, as I didn't get out into the Pacific until after the war was over, actually. But when I could see I was about to get out, I started applying for Yale. My older brother, one older brother was killed at Iwo Jima. And he wrote me a letter before he went in saying, please be sure that our younger brother, Tony, gets into Yale. So I started writing on his behalf without knowing that he was already getting a scholarship to Yale. But I thought, well, if I'm writing for him, I'll write for myself as well, thinking I don't stand a chance, having been tossed out of Cal. But they accepted me. When I started writing, they said, okay, you say you've been to the University of California. We need some kind of a certification from Cal that you were there and that you left under honorable circumstances, I guess. So actually, a cousin of mine was living in Berkeley, so I asked her if she would, intercede for me and find out what had to be done. And she found it, and she got the thing and sent it to me. And here it said that I had been granted an honorary dismissal from the University of California with a proviso that I not be admitted back. But they relaxed that because I took a summer course in organic chemistry a couple of years later. Well, that was when I got out of the Navy in 1946 and was going into college. I got into the end of my freshman year, and I said, okay, I got a fork in the road. I'd spent 3 years as a hospital corpsman in the Navy, so I was thinking about medicine as a career, but then I was also thinking about forestry because it would keep me outdoors for a while. And I rationalized, I said, well, I'm probably not bright enough to make it to medical school anyway, and if I am, when I get through medical school and get through internship and residency, I'd be 32 years old before I could start practice. So I took the road for forestry instead. And probably I wasn't really that well fitted for it because I really wasn't very good at math. And that's what you really need. Well, you have the Yale College, and then you had the various schools, the nursing school, medical school, forestry school, whatnot, divinity school. And for a while, for a few years after the end of World War II, they instituted this 5-year program where you did your first 3 years of undergraduate courses at Yale with a whole bunch of requisites. And then your 4th year you spent as your first year in the forestry school, but it counted toward getting your bachelor's degree on the one hand, but it also counted for a year for getting your master's. So in 5 years, you did a 6-year program. It was mostly, I guess, for the veterans coming back, but actually in our class, of the 6 or 7 of us who were in that 5-year plan, there were only 2 of us who were veterans, actually. The associate dean, who was my counselor, happened to be a friend, and we used to go duck hunting together a lot. And I got through just about the end of my 3rd year, and he called me in. He said, you know, he said, for a Bachelor of Science degree at Yale, you have to have 2 years of German or 2 years of French, and you took Spanish. And it was interesting because my 3 roommates all took French while I was taking Spanish, but I'd taken enough French in high school, I used to read their papers for them before they submitted them. But I said, well, Spanish it is, what do I do? He said, well, you just go talk to your forestry school counselor. So I went to talk to old Doc Castle, and he said, tell him you're going to work in South America. So I went back lying in my teeth at the time because I was going to come out to California to go to work, and said, forestry school says as long as I'm going to be working in South America, they don't care. So Dave said, fine, okay. So they waived that, and I managed to graduate. The first job I had right out of forestry school was doing timber inventory work in southern Brazil, which was Portuguese, but not Spanish, but close enough so that I was fluent enough in it. Yale has a spring camp down across in Arkansas where you spent from March to the end of May doing practical field work. It's surveying, landline running, timber cruising, log scaling, the whole works. And one of the things was visiting sawmills. And visiting one of these sawmills, I got to talking to this guy. I was talking to one of the people at CrossIt who said he was going to interview about doing a job in Brazil. And so I ran across the guy who was responsible for that, so I began asking him about it. And he showed me a bunch of pictures and everything else. And so one of my responsibilities, I was a class secretary, so I had to write thank you notes to these various places where we visit. So I wrote this letter to Mr. White and thanked him very much and said, while I'm doing it, if there's any space available, I speak Spanish and I got a practical medical background. So if there's a space, I'd sure like to apply for it. And they were originally only going to send 4, but turned out that they made a 5th, and I went down. So that's how I wound up doing that. Well, it's interesting. At Cal, I had thought, well, I'd like to do international relations and maybe pre-law, something like that. And linguistics had always interested me to some extent. So I thought, well, that's it. So the Brazilian job sort of fell in my lap. And so from there on, I was interested in it, you might say. They provided a lot of amenities to us for doing the work. The companies, there were 3 different companies involved that wanted to get this inventory done. And one of them was St. Regis Paper. And so almost anything we wanted, we could get when we were out in the field. So it wasn't a hardship thing at all. One of the 3 partners owned the land. The other part at St. Regis provided multi-wall bags for concrete, which came from the United States. The third was Klabin, which is the biggest paper company in Brazil, who was interested in making those sacks. So they went together on this. And the first job was to see if there was enough timber down there to sustain a mill of the size they wanted to do. And the upshot of it was that the inventory determined that that particular property didn't have enough. But interestingly enough, they could have acquired any amount of timber, really. They could have acquired enough just as slabs and edgings and chipped it at the time, but nobody was doing any chipping yet. Talk about the equator, one of the interesting things when we first went down there, we did for practice the first couple of days, running lines with a compass. And you were running west, and all of a sudden you realize the sun's on my right shoulder. That's not right. I'm running east. And it took 2 or 3 days to really acclimatize yourself or orient yourself to the fact that the sun was going to be to the north and not to the south. And that was an interesting thing for us to discover. With the Spanish, I'd taken a little bit of Portuguese at Cal too, so I knew some of the basics. And the vocabulary is very similar, even though the pronunciations are different. So I got along pretty well. And the others spoke nothing but English. They'd never taken any foreign language at all. Well, we were working with a species of a gymnosperm called Araucaria, Paraná pine. And it grew in pure stands from central Paraná, the state of Paraná, down into Rio Grande do Sul and over into a little bit in Paraguay. And then there's another species in Chile, and a third one called clinky pine in New Guinea, and a little bit in Queensland, Australia too. We're all the same genus as that. And it was a great lumber species. In the old growth forest, you go up 5, 6, 16-foot logs till the first branches, and then they're all in a kind of a blown out umbrella shape. It was a very strange looking tree. In the mornings we'd get up and it would be cold. There'd be frost on the ground. And another trip down there a few years later, I remember a taxi pulling up to the hotel in this little town where we were going to go out and look at other timber. And there was frost on the windshield, and he poured water over it, and the water froze. So it can get cold in Brazil. Yeah, I started to work for Pacific Lumber Company in February, I guess it was, of 1952 after I got back. And we worked there on scaling logs and doing office work. We're going to try to update all the timber cutting that had been going on. in the company, and some timber cruising. And then in June, I got an invitation to go to Panama to work as an assistant logging superintendent. And so I quit PL and went down there and spent a year, and then that operation folded and I came home. The plywood plant was in the city of Panama, not in the canal zone, as it was known then. And all our work was in the province of Darien, which is down in the southeast end of Panama, right against the Colombian border. And to get there, we would have to go by boat from Balboa. It would take about 24 hours to get down to La Palma, which is the capital of the province. And then it would take another 7 or 8 hours to get up to the logging areas where we were working. The tides there were about 16 feet, and this little outboard motor that we had you had to go with the tide. It meant getting up at 2 o'clock in the morning. That's the way you went, because you didn't have enough power to buck against the tidal rivers at all. And that was all hand logging in terms of getting the tree down and bucking it up. There were no power saws in those days, but they did have tractors, Caterpillar tractors, that they used for skidding and getting about to the landings. Mahogany doesn't grow in groves. You have to find each tree, and so part of the work was going out and just prospecting, looking for mahogany trees, and then cutting a trail to them so that the fallers would know where to go and get them. It was a kind of catch and catch can logging type thing. There was no way of doing directional falling because the branches were so big and spread out so far that it was very, very difficult to see how you were going to be able to lay a tree in any given direction. Not at all like our trees here in California. The Panamanian mahogany had certain defects that others didn't have. For example, there was one thing that the plywood plant, they both rotary cut and sliced veneers. The sliced veneers were for decoration, and what you would do is in a sawmill you break them down into what they call flitches, which are maybe 12 inches thick and 18 inches wide, something like that. And they'd slice. They'd put the flitch in a hot water bath for 24 hours to soften the wood, and then it would be put on the slicer, as they call it, and the log would go. The flitch would be put up and down. As it went down, it would shave off a slice of veneer. But some of this mahogany would develop what they call tobacco stain, was what they named it. But it would be a stain for no reason, but it really deteriorated or detracted from the value a lot. Yeah, once the plywood plant shut down, US Plywood said, well, if you want to work at the plant at Anderson, there's a job there, but that's all we've got for you. So that's what I did. I worked on the green end, doing miscellaneous labor and whatnot. And after about, not quite a year, I decided production. I really wasn't interested in production, so I left that and then went to work for Hammon, Jensen Wallen on the Hearst property out of McLeod. And that was really interesting because we were working with a logging operation that was going on, and it was one of the last of the old-time logging camps where you had the people living in the camps, and they had the camp kitchen, and probably the best food you could ever imagine in a place like that. We ate like kings. And it was heavy work. You know, it was a lot. We were doing all sorts of things. We were doing log scaling for one thing. And when I first started, the first month or so, we were scaling on the landing. And in those days, they didn't have front-end loaders. They had what was like a shovel with a set of tongs, and each tong had a rope on it. And there was a hooker at each end. And so that they would set the hooks at each end of the log, and then the shovel operator would lift it and put it onto the truck bed. But meanwhile, the scaler is running back and forth underneath these bell hooks, whizzing back and forth, and we finally decided that was a little dangerous. So that was a railroad logging operation. They run the trucks down 15 or 20 miles to the railroad landing, and so that's where we did the scaling from then on. We did everything. I mean, with Hammon, one of the things, the interesting we did, Hammon and Jensen Wallen had kind of chokehold on the timber inventories of almost all the major redwood companies: Union, Pacific, Hammond, Sage Land and Development Company. And so we were doing a lot. We picked up a lot of cruising of old-growth timber, of which there isn't very much anymore anyway. We did timber management work. We did, what else did we do? Well, I worked a lot in on several Indian reservations, the White River Apache, the Navajo, and the Jicarilla. We did the inventory, and the Uinta Ore, all in the Pacific Southwest, which was really interesting work as well. Yeah, with the Navajo, we were doing a grading cruise. Somebody else had already done the timber inventory, and what we were doing, they never designated any quality on it. So our job there was establishing a grade situation for the log, the pine logs there. And then the others were just strictly the inventory, doing the work. And I think, again, HDNW, having shown the kind of work they do, they just outshowed any other competitor in that line of work. On the White Mountain Apache Reservation, the policy there was fire lookouts would spot a strike or a start of a fire, and they would let it go for 24 hours. If it was still going, they'd send somebody out to look at it. Right north of it, on the Mogollon Rim, was the Coconino National Forest. And the Coconino, it's an established fire service policy, if it sparks, put it out. And the difference in the terrain, in the underground vegetation was dramatic. I mean, on the White Mountain Reservation, it was the classic open park-like stand, and on the Coconino, it was just rabbit brush of ponderosa pine. Well, the same guy for whom I'd gone to work right out of school, we set up a very strong friendship, although he was 10 years older than I. And so one day I get this telephone call from him and say, "How would you like to go back down to Brazil?" And I said, "Well, I don't know if there's a conflict of interest with work with HDNW." And he said, "Well, I'll talk to your bosses about that." So they said, "No, that's okay." So I went down there in 56 and then again in 59, doing the same kind of thing for a company that was thinking about putting a pulp mill in there. No, not really, because a lot of our work, we occupied a kind of a niche for the forest industry at that time. There are a lot of companies interested in going overseas and establishing resource positions. And they didn't have the personnel to do it themselves, and so they would outsource it to us. They would say, on the one hand, Bill and Bodell, for example, said, we want an overall view of what resource potentials there are, and then we want you to narrow it down for us as to places to specifically to look. Or another would say, I've got an opportunity in the Ivory Coast. We want you to go take a look at it as a due diligence to see, what the conditions are. So we're kind of unique. I don't think any other company did it. And today we'd be dinosaurs. That kind of work is gone. But it was great for us at the time. Yeah, when we finally split off from HCNW, my partner's wife worked for a Canadian Bank of Commerce in San Francisco. And she had a friend who was working for an outfit called Ocean Bulk Carriers. And so my partner called me one day and said, what do you know about Ocean Bulk Carriers? So I know National Bulk Carriers, which is D.K. Ludwig, but I never heard of Ocean Bulk Carriers. Why? I said, well, they're starting to export some logs to Japan, and they need some help. So that started, we spent 2 years with them, helping them find logs to export to Japan from the port of Stockton. It started out with the first of the big fires over the Michigan, California Lumber Company area back in 1959, when they were building the dams for the Sacramento Municipal Utility District. And of course they were clearing all the trees out. And here it was November, and they're starting to burn some of those piles. And one of those horrendous north winds came up, and the fire took off and wiped out a lot of timber. And so that's how the export program started. A fellow named Phil English down at Placerville, who was a timber cruiser, went down to the port of Stockton and said, if anybody wants to buy some logs, there's a lot of cheap timber here. So the director of the port of Stockton was over in Japan, and they sent a cable over and said, would Mitsubishi be interested in burnt logs? Yes, how burnt are they? And so that's what started. And so that ran for about a couple of years, and then we got out of that. Of course, the real export program started after the Columbus Day storm of 1962, and that's when the Pacific Northwest just had acres and acres and acres of timber knocked down by those ferocious winds. And so that's when the really heavy exports started. California never figured very large in the export business, actually. The port of Stockton, then the port of Sacramento, and then some out of Humboldt Bay. Yeah, my partner was working for SRI, and SRI got a contract to look at industry development possibilities in Honduras. And so my partner went down on that. And I never went there myself at that time, but we worked on a report on what those might be. And then we got involved with the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. And we contracted with them specifically to what were the forest industry development prospects. And Honduras had a lot of pine stands down there. And they exported a lot of clears, but there was a lot of lower grade lumber that had no home. And so we came up with the idea of maybe a low cost wood housing industry for low-income people. And so the FAO liked that idea, and so we went on to do a feasibility study, and everything was fine. It was really going to be a good job, except that the Minister of Housing, his family owned the concrete industry, and they didn't really want to see wood competing with it, so it never went anywhere. But I remember meeting a FAO guy down in Chile about, that was, how much later? That was 6 or 7 years later. And I was in his office and we were talking, and I mentioned something about that housing study, and he reaches in his drawer and pulled out, he said, "This is my Bible," he said. But it never went anywhere in Honduras. A plywood company up in Portland, Oregon called Evans Products, they had done the same thing US Plywood had done. They had bought a going plywood operation on the north coast of Honduras. And my partner met one of their representatives at a hotel just by happenstance. And from that, we started doing a lot of work for them, both there at that plywood plant and then other things they were looking at, other acquisitions. At that point, plywood made for southern pine was suddenly coming into vogue. Everybody was going into that. So one of the things I did for Evans was spend a lot of time looking in the southern states for possible plywood plant sites, given the resource. It was a really interesting work, going all over the southern states looking. Then Evans bought us out. We thought they were kidding. They said, "How would you like to join us?" Well, you're manufacturing, we're consulting. No, we really mean it because you guys have been doing a lot of good stuff for us. So finally I said, okay, but if we do, we're going to carry on our consulting business, and we're going to be doing work for competitors of yours, and we will, under no obligation to tell you anything about those clients or what we're doing for them. And we did work for Union Camp, we did work for Macmillan Bloedel up in Canada, International Paper, Great Northern. There's a whole bunch of different things that Evans never knew, but we did. So that lasted for about, 63 to 60, about 5 years. And then we bought ourselves back out from Evans and went on our own way again. The Tuolumne Corporation. Overseas, it was very difficult for people to pronounce that name. Tuolumne. Well, what happened? My partner's family came from Groveland, and when it came time to establish our company, our corporation, to come up with a name, we came up with a couple of names which already were on the books. So we were sitting there with a lawyer and finally trying to figure out what we call it. Well, let's call it the Tuolumne Corporation. I bet nobody else has done that. And sure enough, they hadn't. So that's how we wound up with that name. They had the opportunity to buy a going company called Elliott Bay, and they had operations on Mindanao Island in the Philippines, Basilan Island in the Philippines, and northeast Borneo, Kennedy Bay. And so they wanted us again, we were part of an Evans team, actually, to do a due diligence to see whether or not it was a good opportunity, good investment opportunity. And it turned out it was an outstanding investment opportunity. But on the other hand, Evans suddenly realized they didn't have the management to go over and do it. And it was interesting. Weyerhaeuser had looked at it, and it was sort of like what would you call it, a girl being courted by suitors, and Weyerhaeuser had turned him down. But then when they learned that Evans was interested in it, they stepped in and bought. And apparently they made so much money on the first couple of years of operation, they couldn't know where to put it. Yeah, they on the north coast of New Guinea, they had an area there they were interested in trying to develop for forest industry. New Guinea was still a territory, but was about to establish independence. And so the Australians were trying to figure out various economic ways, fisheries, forestry, whatnot, that the country could be self-sustaining. So we had this Vanimo project where, I don't know how many thousands of acres there were in that, but we were asked to do a feasibility study of what kinds of industries could establish. And so we performed that and helped them put out a brochure. It never went anywhere for the longest. I think the Chinese are probably logging there now. Yeah, that was interesting because the editor and publisher of the Australian Timber Journal, one of the guys in New Guinea told me, he said, you know, if you really want to know about the industry, you ought to meet this guy, Con Lemke. So I found Tom Lemke there at it was a sawmiller's annual meeting, something like that. And he said, I don't have time to talk to you right now, but let's get together when you get back to Sydney. So I got back to Sydney and called. They said, yeah, come on over about 11 o'clock. So I did. We sat down, and he put me through an intensive third degree. He wanted to know everything about me, our company, everything. And I was kind of shaking my head. I was the one who was supposed to be asking the questions here. And finally said, right. He said, let's go have lunch. So we had lunch, and then about 8 months later, I get a call saying, if you're going to be in Australia, I guess I had to go down to do the presentation on the Vanimo's project. He said, if you're going to be down here, could you come visit us? We're looking at a chip operation. And so I got back to Sydney, and I went to Con's office. I said, who's this guy Risby anyway? And he said, well, I thought you might be asking about that. He said, I recommended that he get in touch with you. So anyway, what they wanted to do, 13 sawmillers wanted to band together to set up a chip export operation. So we did a feasibility study on that and brought the company into being, and it was a great success for them. Yeah, that was for the United Nations Development Program. When Sukarno invaded Papua New Guinea, the west side, what was then called Dutch New Guinea, the Dutch had a fund, $22 million, I think it was, assigned as a budget for administering that territory. And so they turned that over to the United Nations Development Program and said, here is money for development for you people to decide. It's called FUNDWI, the Fund the United Nations for the Development of West Irian. And so we had the job of looking at seeing what the timber resources were for them. So we spent, I guess, several weeks down on the west end. We had to hike in about 16 or 20 miles inland, and then followed up on the timber inventory that the Dutch had done in 1962, and we were able to find some of the numbers on the trees that they had marked. So we, in effect, confirmed the inventory that they had done. Yeah, that was the same kind of thing. The guy who got in touch with us about that had he'd been in Australia and he'd seen that operation. So he came back and he was working for Arcata Redwood. And he thought, well, maybe we could do this out of Humboldt County. And so we did the same thing there and established the company that I don't think that's an operation anymore, probably, but it went for quite a while. Yeah, that was something that was a waste of money. I look back on it, really. They had an opportunity to get a resource position in what was known as the Thai Reserve. It was a reserve and not really a going timber operation or anything. And they'd sent one person over, and so they asked me to go over to look into the possibilities, and came back and said the resources there. It's a question of the market, because the market for all the Ivorian timber was Europe, and primarily France, and it all went out as logs. And the Union Camp was thinking of putting a sawmill in there. So what the fallout of that was doing a market study in Europe to try to figure out, okay, how amenable would the European market be for accepting sawn lumber from the Ivory Coast rather than bring in as logs. And the Germans, the Italians, and the French were all extremely reactionary. They had no interest in buying lumber at all. And so that kind of gave up right there. Well, actually, we came up to, the whole family came up, my son and I, to go quail hunting with friends who had property down about 10 miles south of here. And on the way up, Sarah said, well, might think about buying some property up here. And yeah, I might. I was not thinking much about it. So while we were out quail hunting, our host said, well, there's this neat ranch, the best little ranch in Nevada County, for sale. So Sarah came and looked at it with the realtor. And so we wound up buying this property. And we were raising livestock, and we established I put in a vineyard, one of the early vineyards of the county, and got really interested in that, and helped found the first winery here, and served on this board of directors until a couple of years ago. Helped establish the Grape Growers Association, and worked with that with the Farm Bureau too. So we were really busy with that. Yeah, Mitsui. We'd been doing work for Mitsui. They were doing a chip export program out of Sacramento, Port of Sacramento. We used to do a chip inventory for them every year, and so and also they had been the primary customer for our Tasmanian friends operation. So I get a call from this Mr. Ito asking me if I could go up and look at a situation that west of Anchorage, there's been a big spruce bark beetle kill, and they were looking at salvaging it. And he said, don't worry about the inventory. He said, we know all about that. He said, what we're interested in is delivered log cost for export. So I took a logger friend of mine up, and we went out and we compared what they said, the inventory information they had, with what we were looking at. And so I called out of Seattle and I said, there is no way that we can see that there is as much timber there as that inventory information seems to indicate. And we really recommend that we do some inventory work here. So I said, okay, go ahead. So, which is very unusual because the Japanese, when you put something like that, I think we better go back to Tokyo and ask, find out. But no, this I said, go ahead, do it. So we did, and we came out with considerably lower, and they were very unhappy to hear this. But then about a year later, I get a telephone call, and it was Ito. He said, Peter-san, he said, you remember whatever the name of that place was? Yeah, sure, Ito-san, I remember. He said, well, he says, seems you were right. So that operation never came to be. Yeah, my partner was, once we moved up here, he decided that he would split off. So he went to Crown Zellerbach. But he brought me in when Crown decided they were interested in some conifer and eucalyptus plantations that had been established in Brazil, and they were thinking about setting up an operation. So it was our job to go down and look at each one of the plantation areas and see which ones might fit in with Crown's plans. The upshot of it was that Crown never did do anything down there. A couple of companies did, but Crown didn't. Well, it was both eucalyptus and pine, Caribbean pine. And the eucalyptus was grandest, I guess. Yeah. Yeah, that was, they're putting up a dam, and they wanted to know what the impact was going to be. And it's interesting because in terms of forestry, we're trying to figure out what impact that would have and, what could be done. And there was talk about doing reforestation around the edges of the, and so we worked on that, and what they wound up doing was planting teak, and they did quite a good job with that. Teak is, I just had an email from a friend of mine, a guy who worked with, Bill Libby worked with, as a matter of fact, just a couple of days ago, saying that his company was going into different clones of teak. So apparently it's taken off a lot. That was 30 years ago, and now it's cropping up again. That project was written by a team of, I don't know, must have been a dozen people. And it covered everything you could think of. And it won an award for being such a comprehensive project. And so I was asked to come down so they could look at me and I could look at the project. I was to be principal forestry advisor. So I went down. I was to be there for 2 weeks, and then I'd come home, and then they'd decide. Well, I started reading this project paper, and I made a lot of notes on it. And then I went to my principal contact, and I said, this is not a job for which I am qualified. I said, what you want is somebody with qualifications completely different from mine. I said, if you can't find anybody else, I said, I'd accept it, but I'm not asking for it. And I said, okay. He said, we'll get you out here tomorrow. So we did. It was a funny little, then about 6 weeks later, I got a call. It's Fausto again. And he said, well, we can't find anybody else. And so I wound up with a job. And it was funny, too, because the night before I left, I went down to a steakhouse that I knew. And as I was sitting there, this band of young people came walking in and went to the back of the restaurant. So I asked the waiter, I said, would you find out if those are Peace Corps volunteers? And he came back and said, yeah. I said, they are Peace Corps volunteers. And so this note came back saying, who wants to know if we're Peace Corps volunteers? So I wrote a note in Portuguese back. And so then I went back and they were sitting there trying to figure out what I was saying. So I introduced myself and sat down with them and really had a great time. I bought their dinner for them because things were dirt cheap in Ecuador at the time. I got home and I told Sarah, I said, you know, if it turns out that we do get this job, I said, we'll have a house big enough for Peace Corps forester volunteers. So that's what we did. We went down there, and by the time we left, Sarah had found 20 other mission families who were taking Peace Corps volunteers. But we've kept in touch with those volunteers all these years. 4 of them were here just the other day for lunch. It was really neat to see them. What they had, all kinds of things. They had plantation forestry, reforestation work, tropical forestry, forest policy, how many other things? Forest entomology. And it was interesting, of all these sub-projects, the two that were the most successful were ones that were not included. One was forest protection. The entomologist, technical advisor who came down to look at taking the job, he was a professor of forest entomology at University of Washington, just a great guy. And he said, look, this should be a forest protection project, not a forest entomology project. I said, okay, write the ticket. So we did, and it was astoundingly successful. The other was the tropical forestry that we got to come and take a look at. He said, you know, what we really should be looking at is agroforestry, where you combine cash crops with tree growing. And that turned out to be a remarkable success. Those were the two biggest successes of the project. And the project itself, in lots of other ways, didn't do an awful lot. It was just too much to try to do at once. I was able to stay pretty separate from it. I got exposed to it a lot. Yeah, especially industry bucking against the government. There was a lot of that going on. Well, it's always claiming they were overregulated. You know, it's typical of that kind of thing. Going right back to where I started almost, with my time with HCNW, I did timber harvest plans and non-industrial timber harvest plans up around Truckee. And then for local people here, just little jobs of, some of these exemption type things where you help them submit their plans to CDF or CAL FIRE, whatever you want to call it now. There wasn't much foreign work to do. I did one job for International Finance Corporation in Ecuador, helping out with a plywood company that wanted to get a loan to do some work. but that was the last international work I did. And I really wasn't interested in going overseas. I'd done it. Back in the early days when people were looking for establishing resource positions, that was doing it. They weren't doing that anymore. A lot of them had pulled back from the positions they'd taken. So yeah, I guess you say that kind of work had dried up. Yeah, the land trust, it was interesting. I'd taken a spill. We were walking out of the veterinarian's office. We'd taken the dogs down for shots, and each of us had a dog. And so Sarah was trying to write a check, and her dog was pulling it. This is one of the dogs here. It's a small dog. I said, I'll take the dogs. So we walk out the door. As soon as I open the door, they sail out, and I sailed out behind them and landed on my butt and broke my femur. So while I was in the hospital, Ron Mathis came in. Ron is one on the board, and he said, how about joining the board of the land trust? So I said, well, I haven't got much else to do right now. So I did. So I was on it for about 3 years, and Jerry and I worked together a good bit on one of the committees there. And our job, that committee, more than anything else, was try to roust out and find new directors. And so a new president came in, and the way the corporation had been set up, or the land trust had been set up, had 20 directors. And of course, back in those days, when you started out, it was all volunteer work and whatnot. And so 20 directors were doing a lot of things, you might say. But so I got to say, 20 directors seems a little bit top heavy. He said, no, he says, I want to fill all the positions. So Jerry and I worked to fill all the positions. That president retired. New president came on, and he said, I want to cut it back to 10. I said, okay, I'm resigning first. So anyway, we cut it back to 10, and now I think it's even less than, no, I think it's 11 now, something like that. But it made a lot of sense in that it was all volunteer at first. And then as you start building up a staff and you start getting paid people on it, then it changed. And your need for that many directors dropped off a lot. That one guy that I worked with in Brazil for certain, Zeb White, he wound up as professor of industrial forest management at Yale, actually. He was a great mentor. And then Bruce Lamb, whom I worked for in Panama, was a great friend, and working under him, I learned a lot, you might say. The Tasmanian chip thing, the Minister for Industry was demanding that they commit to putting a pulp mill in. And so I was meeting with him and our principal client and my partner, and I was able to convince him that a feasibility study, a pulpwood plant would not be feasible right now, that we could in time commit to a feasibility study that would determine whether or not that could be done. And I thought I wasn't going to get anywhere with him by bringing this up, but for some reason he came around. I always felt I couldn't believe that it had happened. Well, it's so different today from what I knew that it would be hard for me to give him any advice. I really wouldn't know what to tell him. It's so different. I mean, the Yale Forest School started off, it was forest management and wood technology. and there were the dirt foresters, those was in forest management, and the wood busters. And that's all there were. Then I remember so clearly when they decided to change the name from the Yale Forest School to the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Sciences. A lot of the old guard threw up their hands and said, "This is ridiculous. This environmental stuff. It just doesn't go." But that's where it is today. And those people doing that kind of work, I admire them to beat the band, but I don't know that much about what they're doing. And so my advice to a young person would not be of all that much value, I don't think. Boy, look at California, the extent that regulation has taken place since the first Forest Practice Act back in 1946, something like that, and the amount of regulation that has piled on ever since probably be the largest. Well, of course, with Palco, I was in Ecuador when Hurwitz took over, and that, to my mind, was the worst tragedy of the world, because PL had been very, very conservatively, the forests were conservatively managed. They were really doing a good job. And when he came in and started to lay waste, that was really something. Hammon, to some extent, when Georgia Pacific bought them out, that too was a kind of an eye-opener for people. They said the three catastrophes that hit Humboldt County were the earthquake, the 1955 storm, and Hammon being bought out by Georgia Pacific. Land ownership has changed dramatically. That thing of the PL, for example, I think it was just Hurwitz getting one member of the Murphy family to sell their equity in the company that gave him his foothold to get the rest of it. And then also all those family-owned operations, Union, PL, Arcata, all selling out to larger operations. Georgia Pacific, Louisiana Pacific, that was its own disaster. Yeah, real estate investment trust. Yeah, those are especially in the Pacific Northwest. Not so much here, I don't think, in California, but up there, yeah. And of course, Sierra Pacific, the gigantic amoeba that just swallowed everything.
You want me to keep that on tape?